Chapter 11 of The Dog with Golden Eyes. On Saturday morning, Cassie ate breakfast and left for the Ulmers while her mother was still asleep. As she rang the doorbell, she wondered, what will happen this time? The door opened and Mrs. Ulmer stared at Cassie a minute. "I remember you," she said. "You came to work on the lawn." "Right," said Cassie, relieved. "Your name is Cassandra." "Right again," said Cassie, smiling. Mrs. Ulmer went into the garage and pointed toward the back. "There's the bench for your kneeling that I talked about, and the garden gloves and the garden tools. Help yourself to whatever you need. Just be sure to put everything back the way you found it. I can't find things if they're not where they belong." At the back of the garage, Cassie discovered a little work table littered with tools and some garden gloves. She poked around, and underneath the work table she found a bench for kneeling stuck into a child's red wagon. She dragged the red wagon out and released the kneeling bench. The wagon was old and rusty. Faintly visible on the side was the name Flyer, painted on the side. It must have belonged to one of the other kids, Cassie thought. She shoved it back under the work table. She didn't need the kneeling bench. Her watering yesterday had paid off. Her hands were still really quite sore, but she wore the heaviest pair of garden gloves and had no trouble digging up the rest of the weeds in square one. Then she tackled square two. After a while, she rocked back on her heels and studied the lawn. It really was looking better. She decided to take a break and eat one of her snacks. She packed crackers spread with peanut butter, and she sat down cross-legged. Mrs. Ulmer silently appeared by her side. Cassie jumped. "Would you like some cider to go with your snack?" "Oh, that would be great, please." Cassie got up, brushed off her jeans, and laid down the gloves and trowel and followed Mrs. Ulmer onto the porch. She looked down at her shoes. "I'm too dirty to go in the house. I'll just sit here on the steps." Mrs. Ulmer nodded with approval. She came back and handed Cassie a tall glass of cider. "You're as good a worker as you said you were. Are you like this with all your jobs?" Cassie took a long drink, stared at the cider, and shook her head. "No, only when I'm really interested." Mrs. Ulmer laughed. "So, do you like gardening?" "Yes, ma'am. I used to keep our own lawn up with it being really nice, but my mom started to go to work, and so I started to spend more time inside the house, and I sort of let the outside go." "That's understandable." On the porch was a dilapidated folding chair. Mrs. Ulmer pulled it out next to Cassie and sat down. "Tell me about your dog. What color is he?" she asked. Cassie started smiling. "He's white, pure white. He shines like silver. And yesterday he was waiting for me. When I went outside to feed him, he was already there. He did a sort of happy dance to show how glad he was to see me. He almost knocked me down." "Oh, I wish I would have seen that." "And then, after he cleaned up his dish, he acted like he wanted me to follow him for a walk, so I did, up the hill." My. Looks like your dog has adopted you, just as you hoped." Cassie nodded. "It sure was hard climbing that hill, but I didn't want to disappoint him. I went about the third the way up. It was a steep hill." "He's certainly lucky you found him. What's his name?" "I call him Toki. I got that from a book about Alaska." "Why Alaska?" "Oh, I forgot to tell you. He looks like a sled dog from Alaska, with slanty eyes and thick fur." "Goodness, a Siberian husky, perhaps?" "A husky is too small. My dog is even taller than a Malamute. I can't find any pictures that look just like him. My science teacher says he's probably a crossbreed. They don't do that with sled dogs." She stood up and handed the empty glass to Mrs. Ulmer. "Thanks, I've got to go back to work." "It's unusual for an Alaskan sled dog to be running around loose, don't you think?" Cassie hesitated. "Well, I think somebody brought him down here from Alaska, and he jumped out of their car, and they didn't know that they'd lost him." "You're looking in the lost and found ads, aren't you?" "Mr. Kroll keeps looking in the paper for me, but whoever owns him hasn't advertised." "Why don't you advertise in the paper?" Cassie scuffed the dirt from one of the bottom of her feet. "I don't want to. He was so scared when I found him. I bet somebody has mistreated him. Why would I send him back to people like that?" Because he belongs to them. That's why, Mrs. Ulmer answered. Cassie looked at her without blinking. I'll think about it. And she went back to work on the weeds, jabbing each one as hard as she could, as if it had been a person who had mistreated her white dog. Mrs. Ulmer watched her for several minutes. You can work for 2 hours today, if it's not too much. I'll be glad to, said Cassie. That meant she could buy the big sack of dog kibble today for sure. Say, I saw a little red wagon under the work table. Could I borrow it to haul the big sack of dog kibble home? Of course, Mrs. Ulmer replied. I use it for hauling flower pots around. It belonged to our son Danny when he was little. You can take it home with you when you leave and bring it back on Monday. Cassie saved the last half hour for watering the different squares of the lawn. She coiled up the hose, put back the gardening tools, and pulled the little red wagon out of the garage. It squeaked terribly as it wobbled along behind her. Mrs. Ulmer smiled and handed Cassie $8. Sounds like it needs some oil. I'll find some at home, she said. The noise of the wagon kept time with her steps as she trudged off to the market. What in the world you got there? Asked the clerk as Cassie pulled the wagon inside the door. I've come to buy this sack of dog kibble, and I'll haul it home in the wagon. She pulled it to the back of the store where the kibble was stacked. And I need a can of dog food. Mr. Ulmer was at the cash register and watched her progress. Looks like our wagon, he commented. It is, said Cassie. Mrs. Ulmer loaned it to me for the dog biscuit. I'm sure it needs some oil. He brought out a can from under the counter and bent over the wheels. He twirled one each time. This ought to do it. Gee, thanks, said Cassie, moving the wagon back and forth, and the noise was gone. Anyone who works hard like you for a dog deserves help. And how is your dog? He's fine, replied Cassie. Yesterday we went for a walk together. We climbed part way up the hill. The clerk asked, You want the 40-pounder of Chuck? Chuck? Chuck is for big dogs. That's what you've got. Yes, Chuck, she said. Thought so. He lifted down the large sack of kibble and laid it on the wagon. Near the sack of the dog kibble hung some leashes, collars, and assorted toys for dogs. Cassie studied them. She thought about getting the collar for Toki, but decided to wait until they were really good friends before she tried to put one on him. She looked at the toys. A squeaky mouse with a fierce expression caught her eye. She handed it to the clerk. I'll take this, too. She paid Mr. Ulmer and started home, pulling the heavy wagon behind her. When she came to Mrs. Chimera's house, she saw the beautiful gold-colored Lexus in the driveway. At least she doesn't work on Saturdays, thought Cassie. Where did she work, she wondered. As she walked by, Miss Chimera came out of her front door and called, Come up on the porch for a couple minutes, would you? I'd like to talk to you. Cassie hesitated, then parked the wagon and went up the walk. Miss Chimera motioned to one of her 2 patio chairs for Cassie to sit down. I saw my gardener the other day. He's good at gardening, but he drives me crazy with that leaf blower machine. It's too noisy, and I can't work when it's all running. What kind of work do you do? I'd like someone to rake the sycamore leaves by hand. I'd pay you $5 an hour. Would you be interested? The end of chapter 11.